right? So why don't we start? Let me briefly just say that this first panel is supposed to talk about the issues in the Western Balkans, individual countries, overall the region, impressions, the way you see issues recently, obviously with the COVID pandemic, but also most recently with the military aggression in Ukraine, which is going to affect many things in the way we do business, in the energy prices, and in many other things, including the financing and so forth. We do have three participants in the panel. One is Jasmine Chakeri. She is joining us from, I guess, Vienna or London. Yeah, Jasmine? No.
I'm in Vienna.
From Vienna. Okay, very good. Good to see you again. Last time we spoke was in May. I kind of rely on you to give us the most recent quick overview of the regional World Bank sort of economic developments that came out 3 or 4 months ago, but also what you see as new developments and new challenges. Then we also have Peter Sanfi from London joining. He's at the place, right? Physically. He's going to talk from the EBRD point of view and has the liberty to pick the topics. And finally, we have Hrvoje Šimović joining us from Zagreb. I think he joined the meeting in Kopaonik, and we'll be talking probably from the perspective of Croatia, but also share some impressions about the regional development issues. To make the long story short, I recently kind of looked at the numbers, and when we see all the reports, the World Economic Outlook, the World Bank regional report, the IMF regional reports, they were all talking about the economic revival in 2021, a rebound from the 2020, which was under huge stress caused by the coronavirus and all the related events. But then we also saw many other things. Some of them were expected, some of them were really a surprise. The surprise was the tremendous increase in the energy prices, tremendous increase in all the commodity prices, constraints on the supply side, which nobody anticipated. This was a kind of a normal in the initial stage of the pandemic caused shock. But now the supply bottlenecks that we saw even before this most recent disruption were a surprise. Also, we saw almost a perfect storm combination of which is a fiscal support, accommodating monetary policy that basically started, should have been eased down when the pandemic was over. Some of it continued. So we do have a lot of increase in the aggregate supply and aggregate demand, which then created some demand inflation. Then we saw the cost push inflation coming from abroad. We also saw some elements of disruption in the markets that were caused by the continuation or resumption of the fourth industrial revolution. So we have all those things mainly in the labor market, which seems to be reviving much slower than the rest of the economy. So essentially, we do have a free type of a format of discussion about your most recent impressions. What do you see as challenges and so forth? As I indicated in the email, your initial interventions could be or should be kind of a shorter so that we can have another round of follow-up questions to deepen a little bit the discussion. We don't have the task to cover all the issues. Basically, what we would like to do is to stress some of the important highlights as you see them and as the audience in Kopaonik forum would potentially be interested in. So why don't I start with you, Jasmine? You're on the screen already, and next to me, you are the only one virtually present in the meeting. Please go ahead.
Sorry, just at that very moment, the telephone rang. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you.
Great. It's a pleasure to be here and participate again in the forum. I apologize for not being able to participate in person, but I will try to give you a quick overview as requested on the way we see the recent economic developments in the Western Balkans, and then talk a little bit about the outlook in light of the recent developments as well that Dusan already referred to. On the recent economic developments, I think what we observed in 2021 is a fairly strong recovery of the Western Balkan economies following the COVID. We estimate growth in 2021, average growth for the region at around 7% compared to the minus 3.3% in 2020. So that's a very strong growth performance. It was mostly driven by consumption, but we also see a pickup in investment in 2021. As a result of that, also the labor market started to recover. However, as we already saw during COVID, the most vulnerable groups in the labor market, which are youth and women in particular, continued to have the most precarious work arrangements, and therefore were the ones most affected initially, and will also be the ones that benefit from the recovery more slowly than other groups. But overall, we see positive developments in the labor markets. Unemployment continued to stay at around 16% on average in 2021. And of course, one of the key challenges, speaking of labor markets in the Western Balkans, is the continued low labor force participation in the region. On the external side, imbalances have been narrowing. The current account deficit dropped slightly from around 5.8% to 5.6% of GDP between 2020 and 2021. And this is largely thanks to recovery in remittances, but also exports. We see the FDI, foreign direct investment, remained below the pre-pandemic levels. And overall, external vulnerabilities continue to be high, especially if one looks at external debt, which is on average at 94.4% of GDP, and increased significantly. This reflects a significant increase during the pandemic. Dusan, you already referred to inflation, and the Western Balkans also saw a strong increase, largely due to energy and food prices. So mostly external supply side issues. In some cases, there were domestic issues as well. But this had an effect also on poverty reduction, especially when food and energy prices go up. Households, and in particular poorer households, are negatively affected by that. On the fiscal side, we saw a fairly strong consolidation in 2021 from an average fiscal deficit of over 7% to around 3% in 2021. And that reflects both a withdrawal of the COVID fiscal support, but also we see slowly an increase in capital spending that will help support the recovery going forward. Now, probably the part that's much more difficult is the outlook part. And I want to preface this by saying that the uncertainties right now are extremely high. Not only are there lingering uncertainties related to the developments on COVID and new variants, but also related to inflation, and more importantly, but also relatedly, the Ukraine war and the sanctions on Russia. So these represent major uncertainties. It makes it very difficult to make projections for this year and beyond. We are currently in the process of updating our spring regular economic report will be issued as always around April, around the spring meetings, and that's also when the ECA regional outlook comes out. But But I think what we can say about the Western Balkans is that the main transmission channels of the war and the sanctions are likely to be on the energy side. With higher prices, the Western Balkans are particularly dependent on gas from Russia in particular. So we will probably see higher prices for energy, higher inflation overall, and also most likely deterioration in the balance sheet of energy producers and energy distributors, which may also have a fiscal impact eventually. There might also be higher prices of other commodities, including food and metals, given the importance of Ukraine and Russia in these sectors. And then in terms of second round effects, also a slowdown in investment and growth, depending on how badly affected the advanced economies, and in this case in particular the EU countries are. Some countries in the Western Balkans, of course, have particularly strong ties in certain areas, for example, on tourism. Montenegro has a large share of tourists traditionally from Russia and also from Ukraine. So there will be localized additional effects, but we will probably see, as a result of all of this, a downgrade of our economic outlook for the region compared to our fall outlook. So that's, I think, on the risk. Maybe let me just say, keeping our eyes also on the agenda beyond the immediate term, and I think this is similar to what we discussed last time, is the binding structural constraints that the Western Balkans economies are facing in the areas of productivity, human capital, connectivity and digitalization, and also in the area of governance and rule of law. And these are all areas where structural reforms continue to be extremely important for medium-term sustainable growth. And then also, of course, and this is related to the theme of the forum this year, the area of green growth, inclusive green growth, which is increasingly important given also the EU Green Deal, and generally the commitment towards climate change targets. So this continues to be an important agenda, and maybe I should stop here because I think I've used up my 5 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your contribution. This is just the first round, and I think it's a very good introduction. We will follow up with some more questions. Why don't I give floor next to Peter Henfe to give us the EBRD and his personal perspective on the Western Balkans developments and outlook.
Thank you very much, Dusan, and good afternoon, everyone. I must say it's a really great pleasure to be actually here in person in Kopernik and to have the honor of taking part in the first panel of this really great event. It is more than 2 years since I've been in Serbia, and so much has happened in the meantime, and so much of that has been of bad news nature. So I want to start off my remarks and start off this panel and this conference with trying to inject a note of optimism. It's not easy to be an optimist at the moment, but I'm going to try. And I'm going to try and tell you a little narrative about the Western Balkans that I think we, as particularly from the EBRD, an organization that's facilitating investment here and with an investment focus, something that's really important in order to attract people to this region. So when I look at the Western Balkans, taking the round and having covered this region for really quite a long time, I think you can tell a positive story about this region. Firstly, convergence. You can look at GDP per capita or any other indicator and say, well, this region is well behind Western Europe, OECD countries. But we know that poorer countries should grow faster than richer ones, provided the right conditions are in place. There should be convergence. And actually, we are seeing, despite all the problems, we are seeing some convergence between the Western Balkans and the richest Western European countries. Several years ago, we did a little calculation internally at the EBRD looking at GDP per capita relative to EU countries. And at the time, it was only about 1/4 of the rich Western EU countries, which at the time included the UK. Now, if you do the recalculations again, it's more like 30%. It's not a huge jump forward, but it is positive progress. And I'm convinced that in the years to come, that convergence will happen. Secondly, there's resilience. I often tell people that this is really quite a resilient region. It has come through so much in the past decades. And if we look at how it came through COVID-19, yes, there was a recession in all countries. Yasmin has given some of the figures. But there's a really strong bounce back. I mean, Serbia particularly stands out. A recession last year of less than 1%, growth in 2020, growth in 2021, 7.4%, according to the latest estimate. And other countries in the region are also bouncing back to their 2019 levels, if they haven't already reached it. Then thirdly, you have stability. This really is, and it may surprise some who haven't followed the region maybe in recent years, but this is a stable region, and it's stable in a macroeconomic sense. Again, even despite COVID, we have still stable currencies. We have inflation, which is not out of control, although it is rising, as it is globally. And we have the fiscal accounts under control, despite the COVID shock, despite the need for extra spending to cope with that. They are still being, I think, managed by and large quite well in this region. And then lastly, investment. So we are still seeing a lot of investment interest in the Western Balkans. And we at the EBRD, as a leading investor, last year, once again, we committed more than €1 billion to this region, about half of that, $500 million in Serbia alone. And I think this is very much at the focus of both governments and private businesses. Just under a week ago, we hosted, once again at the EBRD, our biennial investment summit, and we saw really a strong commitment to putting the Western Balkans on the investor map from all the prime ministers in the region. So I think there is a narrative to tell about the Western Balkans as an investment destination, as an attractive place to come and invest. Now, I don't want to pretend that everything is rosy in the garden here, far from it. And Dusan, you asked us to focus on, in this panel, on problems and solutions. So let me say a few words about what we see as some of the biggest problems and how they might be solved. And at the EBRD, those of you who follow us closely know that we look at economies from the point of view of qualities. What sort of qualities would you like an economy to have? And there are 6 in particular we would like any economy to have. We'd like it to be competitive, well-governed, green, inclusive, resilient, and integrated. This is a sort of EBRD Bible nowadays. And when we look at this region, I think that the 3 qualities where there really needs to be improvement are on governance, green, and integrated. So on governance, I think, again, as long as I've been covering the region, I think this has been a besetting problem here, public capacity of public administration in particular. The fact that jobs are very often allocated on connections rather than on merit, the fact that in the public service, jobs are often replaced when governments change, not because the people are doing a bad job, but simply because they're not connected with the new regime. If I can quote one statistic, which I often trot out at these kind of events, from our Life and Transition Survey, which we do jointly with the World Bank. The last time we did the survey, there's always a question asking people, what is the factor, in your opinion, that is most important for success in life? And you have the options: effort and hard work, intelligence and skills, or, and there are 1 or 2 others, or political connections. Now, in the Western Balkans, if you look at cross countries, across all the EBRD countries, the Western Balkan countries are the ones that cluster at the top of the chart for this, for percentage who say political connections are what matter. 46% in North Macedonia last time identified political connections as the biggest factor. We carried out the survey in Germany as well. The figure in Germany was 3%. And that statistic, I think, illustrates how in this region, and North Macedonia was not that different from, I can tell you, from Serbia and Montenegro and other countries. In this region, it's public administration, public service is too much based on connections and who you know, rather than on merit. So I think the long-term solution, it has to be long-term, is to try to eliminate this cronyism we see in the public sector and move towards a more merit-based system. Secondly, on green, so I think the big problem in this region is the still excessive reliance on carbon-emitting fuels, coal in particular, also the reliance on gas, which is a bit better than coal, but is still not ideal in the long term. So we really hope that this region will move decisively towards renewable sources of energy in the coming years. There is some of that going on, but in our opinion, it's not going quickly enough. And then on integrated, by that I mean with the way in which countries interact on trade and investment. And within the Western Balkans, it's still the case, despite the accession to CEFTA of all these countries nearly 15 years ago, it's still the case that you have substantial non-tariff barriers that hinder trade across borders. So here it's really about trying to promote regional integration, which is something we are very much in favor of and doing our best to promote at the EBRD. So there are problems. I think there are solutions. They will take time, but I'm convinced that with the right effort and enthusiasm, then the qualities of this region that I outlined in the first few minutes, I think will come to the fore, and this region will have an attractive future. And thanks very much.
Thank you, Peter. And now let me give the floor to Hrvoje, who is, I believe, the first time in Kopaoni. Hrvoje, welcome, and give us your impressions about the region, perhaps also additional views on Croatia, both in terms of macroeconomic developments, but also in terms of recovering from COVID. Croatia is heavily dependent on tourism and other service industries. So this may be the biggest challenge for Croatia right now.
Thank you, Dusan, for having here. I also would like to thank Mr. Aca Vlahovic and Serbian Economic Association for inviting me here. Basically, what Jasmine said regarding macroeconomic overview, Croatia fits perfectly regarding not only GDP recovery, but also labor market developments and everything else. Also, Croatia although Croatia is only country for Western Balkans who is member of EU, but have also the problems what last Peter said regarding crony economy, and not only crony economy, also the corruption issues. So basically, Croatia fits perfectly in that sense. Because of Croatia's specific situation, and I would like to emphasize several topics, I will talk about COVID issues, especially regarding GDP recovery. Croatia had earthquake, Zagreb had earthquake, huge earthquake, not only Zagreb and also the Banovina part of Croatia. In the last 2 years, we had 2 large earthquakes, and that is also one specific thing which boosts the investment, and we hope it will boost investment in several years. Also, Croatia as a member of EU have huge funds from Recovery and Resilience Facility, which is a crucial thing that will probably influence our GDP in the next 7 years. Also, what is specific for Croatia is that we plan to introduce euro next year. And that is, we have a bit luck because fiscal rules are suspended for the last 2 years, but fiscal consolidation is in the focus of this government quite a while, and hopefully we will have all macroeconomic indicators well, so we can introduce euro in the beginning of 2023. And finally, Croatia also has issues with the inflation, and because this inflation is on supply side driven, government also had introduced a lot of policy measures to mitigate inflation pressures, and they are basically what every European country is introduced, and it is quite odd to see government dealing with inflation. Usually that is the main goal of central bank, but because of that supply side driven inflation, dealing with commodity prices, especially energy and food, that is something I will finally speak about that. So regarding COVID and GDP, we have recovery, and our GDP recovered on the pre-pandemic levels. We had our GDP contracted for 8.1%, and now the last year we had, I think, the largest GDP growth in the region. It was 10.5. So even this year it will be 4.8, and that is the forecast of European Commission, the latest forecast from February this year. And so that Croatia is on that part is quite doing well. The major thing about increasing GDP is what Jasmine said. It is a recovery of private consumption, and also recovery of tourism, of course. And we are even last year and this year we expect to have rather good result, and tourism as service exports part of our current balance will rather recover, and also with the recovery of GDP. But what we have on the other side, also with the recovery of GDP, our imports also recover. So on that part, our current account is rather balanced. We have that issue of the earthquake, and the earthquake will probably have additional boost in investments in the construction sector and the rebuilding activities in that part. What is crucial about GDP in next 6 years is that recovery and resilience facility. Even though we have huge funds received and will receive from Croatia, what is crucial to emphasize about RRF, that spillover effects, because of spillover effects, our economy will have additional impact on GDP, and even European Commission discussion paper from last year from Pfeiffer and Varga they estimate that the growth in a 4-year period can even be up to 3%, and Croatia will probably be one of the winners with Bulgaria, the east of the European Union, Bulgaria, Romania and Greece will probably, those spillover effects will be higher in this part of the European Union, because other countries will use Croatian, I don't know, companies, etc., to work on the policies that require the funds from RRF facility. Regarding euro, we do not expect any crucial issues regarding euro. Croatia is a highly euroized country with 70% of deposits in euros, debts around 70% also in euros. So all the banks are owned, majority of them are owned by the banks from European Union. So our economy, I think that is similar in all Western Balkans, using euro, that won't be, and we have also huge trade integration with European Union, and that won't be a huge issue. But maybe finally, to say maybe about inflation, even the newest the newest forecast of European Union doubled the inflation rate for Croatia from 1.2 to 3.5, and for this year. So, but who knows what will happen because of the war in Ukraine. But what can Croatia, regarding commodity prices, especially energy prices, especially gas, we are quite resilient here because we won't have a shortage of gas. Most probably, we have some domestic production, about 30% in the northern Adriatic, but Croatia have now from last year operating LNG terminal, but the price is the crucial, because the price is on it's a market price, and I'm not sure that I think we will have higher inflation, not only for first 6 months. That is something what the European Union will have a problem through whole this year, and all it will depend how the circumstances in Ukraine will develop, and that political issue. That is something nobody can now plan what will happen. And maybe for now, that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I suggest that we go with the second round of questions, and let me just follow up on what you already all mentioned. Jasmine, I'd like to ask you a follow-up question. You mentioned productivity, A, and B. I saw a World Bank, IMF joint announcement and the World Bank announcement regarding a lending reaction to the disruptions that may be caused by the ensuing war. What can you tell us about the increases in productivity, which I believe is the main source of getting out? What structural changes were, a lot of policies were directed towards job protection. Now we are at the stage of promoting new jobs and restructuring the quality of the labor supply, responding to the post-COVID challenges in terms of channels, of marketing channels, of sales and so forth on the one hand, and also changes in the world environment in terms of the use of technologies, in terms of the redistribution of production and overall. What is your personal reaction, and how do you see the increased lending program coming in to help ameliorate those issues?
Thank you. So on the productivity side, this is a long-standing issue, not just in the Western Balkans, but in many countries in Europe. And I think there's various things that affect productivity. Some are at the more macro level in terms of establishing a level playing field for the private sector. The Western Balkans, like many countries in the region, have still a lingering fairly large presence of state-owned enterprises. So the transition to a full market economy is still to some extent partial. And that in many ways makes it difficult for the private sector to develop fully to its full capacity. So that's one area, in addition to the SOEs, also in terms of business regulation, how difficult you make it for firms to enter and exit the market, and so on. The other area has more to do at the firm level in terms of how innovative and how productive are firms in the Western Balkans. I think there's still a big agenda in terms of encouraging innovation, making it easier for firms to access financing for innovative activities, improve management of firms, management capacities at the firm level, among other things. And then one area we also discussed earlier is human capital and the availability of skills that the private sector needs to develop. I think here also Western Balkans has a bit of a deficit in terms of ensuring that the right skills are there for the private sector to thrive. So I think on the productivity side, I would mention those. There are others, and some that came out during the COVID crisis in terms of digitalization and digital capacities of firms to operate. during a time of disruption and when there's no physical contact possible. But maybe let me leave it at that for now. In terms of increased lending related to the current war, I think it very much depends. I can't tell you much about specifics here, but I think the World Bank has made it very clear that it stands ready to assist countries that are affected by this, and also assist Ukraine in terms of making sure that the Ukrainian people continue to have access to government services in the short run. So that's I think I would say on that. I don't know to what extent the Western Balkans will be directly affected. As I mentioned earlier, I think the impacts on the Western Balkans will be more indirect from the impact on advanced economies. So we'll see what the economic impact will be in this particular region.
Thank you. Peter, thank you very, very much for highlighting those priorities, especially the issues with governance, which I agree is a long-standing problem. But over the years we've seen and we've approached this issue, and we seem to know a lot about it. We know less what to do about it. So the question is, how do we address the issues of governance at all levels? I think that also at the firm level, we have the issue of the way management is making decisions, of the way they integrate with the workers. We have reason to believe from all these surveys that there's a lack of trust between the qualified labor force and the management, sort of a level of confronted interests rather than the joint interest. And Jasmine also mentioned the issue of labor mobility in the Western Balkans and broader. It seems to be easier for people from the Western Balkans to move to Germany and France and Austria, especially, than to move across very short distances in the Balkans. Do we have anything specific that international organizations can do to accelerate this move towards more transparent and more efficient, most importantly, microeconomic management and the national economic management, especially in the area of defining strategies and adjustment after these crises? I asked Peter primarily, but you can all answer.
Yes, thanks, Dusan. Let me start, but by all means, colleagues, chip in, because this is quite a tough question you've asked, and quite wide-ranging. And I think whenever we talk about governance, I think governance reflects really the state of governance in the economy. I think reflects long-standing norms and rules and behavior, which are difficult to change in the short term. So I think there are no quick fixes for any of this. However, I would say a few things. You can chip away at individual issues and make progress incrementally, and that's something we're at the EBRD we're trying to do with our governance programs throughout the Western Balkans, and on that we have worked closely and benefited from support actually of the UK government, the UK Good Governance Fund, to try and chip away at some of the long-standing issues. It could be business inspections, for example, or something like that where you can make it's small by itself, but when you do enough of these, it starts to make a bigger difference. You alluded also, Dusan, to another issue, the mobility across borders, and this is a serious issue, I think, for the region, and has been for many years. The so-called brain drain, and of course, young people will go where the best opportunities are, and the money is, and that tends to be in the richer Western European countries than in the neighborhood. But again, I'm convinced that if this region can take advantage of its opportunities, And to do that, we do need to see an improvement in governance. But if it can, then that brain drain can reverse. I'm from a country, Ireland, which has a long history of emigration, and that reversed only when really the opportunities at home, and this really didn't happen until the 1990s, really exceeded the opportunities that were abroad. But once that happens, then there can be a reversal. But when it comes to governance, I think what does help, it doesn't solve the problem, and Hrvoje alluded to the governance problems in Croatia, which is an EU member now for 8 or 9 years. But joining the EU, that process does tend to bring in better standards. It means being exposed to something that's not perfect, but that is better in terms of national governance, and those rules and standards over time will be transmitted here as well, I think. But colleagues may want to join in, I don't know.
Yeah, if there are other reactions, please do come in. I just wanted to ask a follow-up question. I wanted to ask Hrvoje to comment on an interesting event, which is the way Croatia quickly and efficiently handled the issue of the Sberbank problems and found a way of not creating a banking crisis. I think it's the Postal Bank of Croatia that took over the Sberbank, and they maintained calm and confidence, as far as I can tell. But this may be a lesson for others. If there are bank disruptions, because the sanctions in the SWIFT system may affect the way banks operate and the way they make basic income in a major way. Is this a model to do it? Because this was a relatively small bank, and the government was quick, and the banking sector was quick to react. But can it be replicated? Hrvoje, what is your sense?
Well, I'm not sure if it can be replicated, but looking at the other Western Balkan countries, and I particularly know a case from Bosnia and here in Serbia and Slovenia, rather quickly handled the case in similar way. We handled it pretty well. It was a surprise for me. It was done quietly. It was done rather fast, and Deposit Insurance Agency reacted also the week before this transaction happened rather fast. But beside that, I have to emphasize that Sberbank in Croatia had only 2% of the market share, so it's a really small bank. And the Croatian proposed bank, which bought now Sberbank, has around 5.7% of market share in Croatia. And that was good transaction for them, I think. And they paid rather fair and rather cheap price. That is something I cannot comment because I don't have knowledge about that. But what I can say that that can be only done if you have at least one bank owned by government. The Croatian Postal Bank, who bought Sberbank, is not fully owned by government, but majority of ownership belongs to government, and that is the case how it was handled, and that's it for Croatia, and it's handled rather well. Although we can see that still there is a lot of major households withdrawing money from a whole banking system, but I believe that thing will settle in a couple of weeks. Again, hopefully with rather positive developments in Ukraine. What I wanted to also comment your question before regarding, I didn't talk about sustainable development because generally in Croatia those things are handled spontaneously. I think that is the case with all Balkan countries. But the last demography census showed also that Croatia had huge depopulation. We lost about 8-9% of population in the last 10 years. Of course, we entered the EU and a lot of our people, the brain damage, what Peter said, went to work abroad. Beside traditional markets like Germany and Austria, there are some new fancy markets like Ireland, Sweden, Netherlands, etc. But that is the case. We started to talk about demography just recently, and other sustainable development the goals like Green Deal and Green Transition and digital transformation are also done spontaneously. Luckily, digital transition is the COVID crisis accelerated those issues in each country, also in Croatian economy. But regarding the Green Deal, we are quite modest, especially in policy issues, to move forward those things. One thing that triggered now, especially the companies regarding the green transition, is the huge price of carbon emissions. And because Croatia is part of European Union and there is not enough of free carbon emission licenses, so a lot of companies have to buy it on the market, and now the price rocketed the last couple of months, and the more and more companies are now planning and focusing on real deal issues, and I believe EBRD and other investment banks are working closely to find solutions for that stuff in Croatian economy.
Very good. We have time. We are now 12 minutes before the end of our slot. So we have time for whatever quick reaction you may have on the issues that we discussed so far. But also I'd like to give a chance for to people in the audience to ask questions if they have any questions, or if there are issues that they'd like to be addressed in writing or in some other way. Are there any questions from the audience? I see only myself and Jasmine, so I really don't know.
There is one question here. If there's a
Please.
microphone.
Thank you. I'm Lorenza Iachia from the Resident Coordinator Office in the United Nations here in Serbia. And my question is, to which extent have we as the economists in this region been able to pass on the message that the green transition is not a cost, but is an essential element of success? And what can we do to reinforce that message, especially during the current crisis? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for asking that question. I think Peter already mentioned that, and I think this was the underlying message behind some of the statements that Jasmine made. Definitely, as you all know, in Serbia, the environmental issues have come to the fore recently and became actually a part of the political agenda. I think this is good. Once something is brought up and discussed in public and actually becomes the basis of some new genuine grassroots political movement, it will then reinforce the issues and try to find solutions. But why don't we go quickly across the panel and hear what your reactions are, how we're doing today, and what can be done to improve that in the short to medium run, knowing that politicians are most sensitive to short-term issues, and smart green investment and environmental long-term issues, which usually fall outside the political interest. Let's start with Jasmine. Do you have any reaction on the?
Look, I think this. The question was also not just to focus on the cost, but also on the benefit, right? There are costs, right? Let's be clear on this. There are costs, and that's what I think in the short term, politicians may be looking at. If you think of transition out of coal, for example, there are big, not just fiscal costs, but costs also to people who will lose their jobs. And so these things have to be very carefully managed. The other thing I would say about the green transition is a lot of focus is on on climate right now, and in particular mitigation, which again carries some costs and of course a long-term benefit globally. But there are other aspects to it, including on the adaptation side, in terms of how resilient do you make your economy to climate and other natural disasters. And I think the Western Balkans can do quite a bit more there, and that can have also can be maybe also the benefits of that can be perhaps be more visible in the shorter term to the population, and therefore also easier to sell, I guess. And then the other thing is there are also green transition issues beyond climate. The whole agenda of air pollution is only partially related has only partial overlap with the climate agenda, but this is also an issue that's very important in the bigger cities in the Western Balkans, and then other aspects related to environmental degradation that need to be tackled. So I think I'll stop here since we are running out of time.
Thank you. Peter?
Yeah, maybe I can say a couple of things. Firstly, over breakfast this morning, looking at the Observer, and just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, I read that Nigel Farage, who I'm sure name familiar to some of you, is planning to campaign for a referendum in the UK on the UK's net zero target by 2050, basically campaigning to remove it, and that depressed me, I must say, when I read that. But so there is a sense in which you have to sometimes appeal to the longer-term vision of politicians rather than immediate costs. But I think there's so much overwhelming evidence now on the damage of carbon-emitting industries and on the benefits of moving towards renewable sources of energy that it has become a lot easier to make the case. And investing in renewable comes with, that in itself will create a lot of, jobs and with these new projects. And if there are investors here interested in renewable projects, please come and talk to us, because we at the EBRD, we see ourselves now as the green bank. And in fact, by 2025, at least half of all our investments will be for green investments. I think the phrase that's used here now all the time is a just transition, in the sense that yes, it will be, any transition is costly to some people, some groups, and you have to have mechanisms in place to help those who are displaced by this shift from, say, the coal industry towards wind or solar energy.
But thank you. Can I just ask a quick follow-up question, Peter, here? From the recent political and massive social reactions to environmental issues, my impression is that there are issues that can be dealt as a trade-off. A little bit, more environmental quality for a little bit lower income. But then something, there are thresholds, there are green, there are red lines that should not be crossed. People basically are saying if you do, detrimental damage to rivers by doing something that sounds good, which is small hydropower plants, but you destroy the environmental balance there, and you create disasters later on. This is where you're crossing that line. So the question is, there are areas where we can handle trade-offs, regular trade-offs, but we are not very good in handling the thresholds that we should not cross. How do we distinguish between these in our policy recommendations, in your lending decisions, and so forth?
I mean, you're right. I mean, some trade-offs are harder to judge than others, and environmental considerations are quite complex to calculate. But I think so there will be specific cases where it's a tough choice, and doing what seems good can actually maybe is doing more damage on the side than is warranted. But in the vast majority of cases, I think the case for moving away from carbon emitting towards renewable energy is really overwhelming. And by the way, I mean, I think even in the relatively short term, sticking with carbon emitting sources of energy in Serbia and other countries in the region is going to be very costly for these countries. Once the EU introduces its carbon border adjustment mechanism, which will put quite serious tariffs on exports of key goods from these Western Balkan countries if they are deemed to be carbon emitting and therefore damaging to the environment. So it's not some issue way off in the future, 2050 or something. It's actually really an important policy issue that has to be addressed now.
Thank you. Roy?
Well, Dusan, regarding this Green Deal, that is like nice bedtime story, especially for Western Balkan countries, and especially if you go further on the rest of the world, there is huge energy poverty, for example, in Africa and some other parts of the world. So basically, I think this Green Deal in Europe is going too fast. And I think that Western Balkan countries who should have more time for green transition than what is expected for them. For me, it's a ludicrous. For example, Serbia has a coal mines, not to use that in the energy production, especially if it's here, if it's cheap. And for example, to invest a lot of money, it's costly, like Peter said, I don't know, it's gas pipelines or some solar systems or something like that. And I think rather poorer countries need more time to develop on rather cheaper energy sources, and then force them to buy rather expensive technology which is developed in the countries who were developed before on cheaper energy sources like gas and coal. I'm talking about Western Europe mostly. Thank you. And this region, not only Croatia, but the whole region, has huge potential in hydro, huge potential in wind, and huge potential in solar, especially in solar. But hydro we have good tradition in producing hydro energy, but electricity from hydro energy, but for the technology for solar energy and technology for wind energy is rather expensive, and that technology is imported. And is it imported from developed countries who develop themselves from cheaper energy sources. So basically, we have the global problem in that case, but we can look it down in Europe's perspective, and Western Balkans countries should have more time for green transition. I think that is something to be considered, especially in the path to the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you for this comment. I think I'd like to use the privilege of moderating this to stress that there's a difference between committing to certain environmental standards and the implementation schedule. So firm commitment that you will do it is what really matters, what's really important. And the speed at which you will approach and achieve that standard or commitment is something that should be realistically discussed and supported both through domestic policy measures, budgets, and through borrowing through international financial institutions. I think we're running out of time. Thank you so much for your participation. I think we are learning to live virtually. So hopefully one day we will all get together and have a cup of coffee and continue this discussion in one of the most frequent places we go to, the Balkans, London, and Washington. Thank you so much, and see you later. Thank you.